My name is Daniel Brooks, and I work construction in Northern California. That's the easiest way to describe it to people. If somebody asks what I do, that's what I say. Construction. Most people picture putting houses up, maybe a crew pouring concrete somewhere outside Sacramento, or building shopping centers off the highway. What I actually do, it's a little different. Most of my work involves digging holes, post holes, foundation holes, utility trenches, equipment pads, sometimes access roads cut into hillsides that haven't seen a vehicle in 50 years. If somebody wants to put something in ground where there isn't already a road, a power line, or a flat piece of dirt, guys like us are usually the ones they call. We work all over Northern California, but most of our contracts come out of one region. People call it the Emerald Triangle. That's the stretch of country where Humboldt, Trinity, and Mendocino counties all meet. If you've ever seen pictures of endless green hills covered in pine trees and fog rolling in off the Pacific, there's a good chance they were taken somewhere in that triangle. It's beautiful country. It's also the kind of place where a lot of things happen that nobody talks about too loudly. If you ask people what the most dangerous thing in the Emerald Triangle is, most of them will give you the same answer. Drugs, illegal grow operations, armed landowners, cartel crews hiding out in the forest, booby-trapped properties, people going missing after they wander too far down the wrong logging road. And some of that is true. I have seen grow sites hidden so deep in the woods that the only way to reach them is by walking an hour uphill through brush. I have seen diesel tanks buried under tarps and irrigation pipes running miles through the trees. Once, we came across a clearing where someone had strung fishing line between trees at neck height to stop trespassers. You learn pretty quickly to mind your business out there. But the drug stories are only part of the reason people disappear in that part of the state. The rest of the time, it's the land itself. The Emerald Triangle, it's full of old mines, collapsed wells, unstable slopes, and logging roads that turn into mud traps after one night of rain. Whole hillsides slide out from under you if you cut the wrong place. Creeks change direction every winter. A truck can vanish down a washed-out ravine, and nobody will find it for weeks. We've pulled equipment out of places that look like they'd been abandoned since the 1950s. Rust-colored bulldozers half buried in dirt. Collapsed timber frames from mining operations nobody remembers. Old drilling rigs tipped sideways under blackberry vines. When you work construction in country like that, you get used to strange ground. My crew usually runs 4 men. Kevin Turner is the foreman. He's been doing this kind of work longer than I've been alive. Kevin doesn't talk much unless he needs to, but when he does, we all listen. He's the kind of guy who can walk across a hillside, kick a patch of dirt with his boot, and tell you whether you're about to hit clay, shale, or bedrock 3 feet down. Then there's Brian Foster, who runs the excavator most of the time. Brian is built like the machine he operates. Slow-moving, steady, and nearly impossible to knock off balance. I have seen him thread a 30-foot boom through a stand of trees without scraping bark off a single trunk. The youngest guy on the crew is Ethan Reed. Ethan handles grade stakes, shovels, fuel cans, and whatever else needs doing. He's strong, quick to learn, and just reckless enough that Kevin spends half his time yelling at him to slow down. And then there's me. I run equipment when Brian's off the seat, do ground checks, measure cuts, and keep the job moving. I've worked construction long enough that none of it feels new anymore. Dirt is dirt, right? Machines are machines. And if you follow the right procedures, most problems can be fixed with a shovel and enough patience. At least that's what I believed when I first took this job. The company we work for takes contracts most construction outfits won't touch. Remote telecom towers, private water systems, utility trenches for survey stations miles from the nearest highway. The kind of jobs where you haul equipment up dirt roads so narrow you can see the drop through the driver's side window the whole way up. Those contracts pay well. A lot better than normal construction work. And the reason, it's simple. Nobody wants them. The locations are remote, the ground is unpredictable, and if something goes wrong, it can take hours for help to reach you. But that's not the real reason experienced crews avoid certain jobs. The real reason is something Kevin told me my first week on the crew. We were parked on the side of a logging road in Trinity County, waiting for a survey team to finish marking a cut line. The fog was thick enough that you couldn't see more than 30 yards into the trees. Kevin was leaning against the truck, drinking coffee out of a metal thermos. He watched the surveyors for a while, then said something that didn't make much sense at the time. Some ground shouldn't be opened unless everyone knows the rules. I remember asking him what rules he meant. He just shrugged and said, "The ones nobody writes down." I figured he was talking about normal safety procedures, watching for gas pockets, checking for unstable slopes, the usual things you worry about when you're digging into unknown terrain. It took a while before I realized that wasn't what he meant at all, because out in the Emerald Triangle, there are places where the ground has been sealed for reasons nobody explains. And if you break into one of those places without knowing the rules first, well, someone on your crew usually dies. Those rules are the only reason I am still alive today. Rule 1. If the dirt turns gray, stop the machine immediately. The first rule Kevin Turner ever taught me didn't sound strange when I heard it. It sounded like normal construction advice. "Watch the color of the dirt," he told me. "If it turns gray, stop the machine immediately." That's not unusual in excavation work. Soil color changes all the time, depending on what layer you hit. You might start with dark brown topsoil, then drop into red clay, then gravel lenses, then shale or fractured rock. Anyone who's dug foundations long enough can read soil like a book. But Kevin wasn't talking about normal layers. He meant a very specific kind of gray. Not ash gray, not dusty clay, not weathered shale. The gray looked wrong. The first time I saw it was on a job in Trinity County, about an hour north of a town so small it didn't even have a gas station anymore. Our contract was simple on paper. Widen a clearing on a hilltop so a telecom company could install a small relay tower. The survey team had already marked the perimeter with orange stakes and spray paint. Our job was to cut the slope back about 20 feet and level a pad big enough for a concrete foundation. Routine work. Brian Foster had the excavator running while I walked the grade line with a measuring rod. Ethan Reed was hauling fuel cans up from the truck. Kevin stood off to the side, watching the cut like he always did. The hillside was mostly red clay mixed with loose shale. Every scoop of the bucket peeled back another layer of it, dumping the spoil into a growing pile downhill from the pad. After about 40 minutes of digging, Brian's bucket bit into something that looked different. First I didn't notice it. Then Kevin shouted, "Stop the machine!" Brian lifted the bucket halfway through its swing and froze. Kevin walked over to the cut and pointed. "You see that?" The exposed wall of soil had changed color about 3 feet down. Everything above it was the usual red clay. Everything below it was gray. But not natural gray. Looked packed, dense, almost powdery, like cement that had been ground back into dirt. Brian leaned out of the cab window. "Just another layer," he said. Kevin shook his head. "That's not a layer." He turned toward the machine. "Back the bucket out." Brian shrugged and started easing the boom away from the cut. He didn't quite make it in time. The tip of the bucket caught the gray layer and punched through it with a dull cracking sound. For a second, nothing happened. And then something inside the hill exploded outward. A spray of thick yellow-gray liquid blasted through the hole Brian had made, hissing as it hit open air. Wasn't water. Wasn't mud. It looked more like a pressurized slurry. Hot, chemical smelling, and moving fast enough to splatter across the ground 10 feet away. 2 workers from a subcontract crew were standing closest to the cut. They never had time to move. The spray hit the first man across the face and neck, and he screamed immediately. The second man caught the worst of it across both arms and his chest. He staggered backward, dropping his shovel as the liquid soaked into his shirt. The smell hit us half a second later. Kevin started yelling, "Water! Get the rinse tank!" Brian jumped down from the excavator while Ethan ran for the emergency wash container we kept on the truck. I grabbed the first man by the shoulders and I pulled him away from the cut. His skin was already turning red, not like a sunburn, like something was eating through it. He clawed at his face, screaming that it was burning his eyes. The second man collapsed onto his knees, holding his arms out in front of him, like he didn't recognize them anymore. The slurry kept pouring out of the hole in the hillside for another few seconds before the pressure inside whatever chamber we'd broken into finally died down. By then the ground around the cut was smoking. Ethan came running back with a rinse tank and we started dumping water over the 2 men as fast as we could. And it didn't help much. Where the liquid had touched bare skin, it left raw patches that kept spreading even after we rinsed them. Their clothes were soaked through, and the fabric seemed to trap the chemical against their bodies. Kevin ordered us to drag them farther uphill away from the spill. We laid them down in the dirt, while Brian called for an ambulance on the radio. The man who had taken the spray across his face, he kept trying to open his eyes, but they wouldn't stay open. The other one had stopped yelling and was breathing in short, shallow bursts. I remember Kevin standing over the hole in the hillside, staring at it like he just confirmed something he already suspected. The gray dirt had cracked open into a cavity about the size of a small barrel. Inside it was a thick pool of the same yellow-gray liquid we'd seen spray out. Looked like it'd been sealed there for years, maybe decades. The walls of the chamber were smooth, almost like someone had shaped them intentionally before packing the gray material around it. Kevin swore under his breath. When the ambulance finally arrived, the 2 men were still alive, but they didn't stay that way for long. Both of them died later that night. The official report, they said they'd been exposed to some kind of corrosive chemical compound trapped underground. The investigation blamed an old industrial dumping site that'd been buried before the land changed ownership. That explanation sounded good enough for the county inspectors, but Kevin knew better. A week after the accident, we were finishing cleanup on the site when we walked over and kicked at the gray dirt near the broken chamber. "You remember what I told you about that color?" he asked. I nodded. "Stop the machine," I said. "That's right." He scraped his boot across the powdery soil. "This stuff, it's not natural ground. Somebody packed it in here. Sealed that cavity so nothing could get out and nothing could get in." I looked down at the hole where the chamber had been. "You think that was some kind of trap?" Kevin didn't answer right away. He just stared at the hillside for a few seconds, and then he said something that stuck with me. "Ground like this gets sealed for a reason." He turned back toward the truck. "And next time we see gray dirt, we stop before we break through." That was the first rule I learned working construction in the Emerald Triangle. And after what happened to those 2 men, I never questioned it again. Rule 2. If you uncover stacked stones, do not move them. The second rule Kevin Turner taught the crew had nothing to do with machines or soil layers. It had to do with rocks. At first glance, that sounded even less serious than the gray dirt warning. Construction crews uncover rocks constantly. Some are natural, some are left over from old structures. Some are debris pushed into the ground decades earlier and forgotten. But Kevin wasn't talking about random rocks. He meant stacked stones. Not piles, not scatter, not a collapsed wall. Actual stacks. Flat stones placed carefully on top of each other in narrow columns, sometimes waist high, sometimes only 3 or 4 pieces tall. They show up buried under soil, where nobody would expect them, usually in places that haven't seen human activity in decades. The first time I saw one was on a job in Humboldt County, about 20 miles inland from the coast. Our crew had been hired to dig a trench for a private water line running up a hillside property. The terrain was steep and covered in pine and redwood, the kind of ground where every shovelful of dirt pulls up roots and loose stone. Brian Foster was cutting the trench with the excavator, while I walked behind him measuring depth and clearing loose debris from the trench floor. Ethan Reed was hauling sections of pipe down the hill from the truck. The trench was only about 4 feet deep when Brian stopped the machine. "Got something here," he said. I stepped down into the trench and brushed dirt away from the exposed shape. At first I thought it was just a cluster of shale, and then the pattern became clear. 3 flat stones stacked neatly on top of each other, each one about the size of a dinner plate. They were balanced so evenly that the edges lined up almost perfectly. There was no mortar, no concrete, no binding material at all. Just rock on rock. But the placement was too precise to be natural. Ethan jumped down into the trench beside me and crouched to look at it. "Looks like somebody built a little tower," he said. He reached down and grabbed the top stone. Kevin's voice came from above us. "Leave that alone." Ethan froze. Kevin was standing at the edge of the trench, looking down, with a hard expression I hadn't seen before. "That's not debris," he said. "That's a marker." Ethan straightened up slowly and set the stone back where it'd been. "What kind of marker?" he asked. Kevin climbed down into the trench and crouched beside the stack. He studied it for a few seconds, then ran a gloved finger across the edges. "They show up sometimes when we dig in this part of the state," he began. "Always stacked like this. Always buried shallow." I looked around the trench. "You think somebody put it here?" Kevin nodded once. "Yes." Ethan glanced uphill toward the tree line. "Who?" Kevin didn't answer that question. Instead, he stood up and pointed farther along the trench line. "Dig around it. Leave the stack where it is." Brian eased the excavator bucket forward again, carefully scooping dirt from both sides of the stones while leaving the stack intact. Within a few minutes, the trench continued past it, and the stones remained standing in the center of the cut, like a small monument. We finished the day's work without touching it. By evening, the fog had rolled down through the trees and the forest had gone quiet. Our crew stayed overnight in a small trailer we hauled up for remote jobs just like this. The machines were parked beside the trench, with portable floodlights set up around the work area. I stepped outside sometime after dark to grab a tool I'd left near the excavator. The lights illuminated the trench, clearly enough that I could see the stacked stones, still standing exactly where we'd left them. Something moved near them. First I thought it was a raccoon, and then it stood up. The figure was short, maybe 3 feet tall. Its body was thick and covered in dirt, the same color as the soil we'd been digging all day. The floodlights reflected off 2 small black eyes that looked more like polished beads than anything human. Another figure climbed up from the trench wall beside it. Then another. They moved quickly but carefully, using the trench walls like ladders. Their arms were thick and strong, and their hands were built for gripping rock and dirt. One of them crouched beside the stacked stones and began adjusting them. It lifted the top piece and set it down again with careful precision, aligning the edges until the column stood perfectly straight. The others watched. None of them made a sound. I stood completely still beside the excavator, and I watched them work. Up close, they looked even stranger than I first thought. Their skin was coated with layers of soil and mud, and scrapes of cloth or leather hung loosely around their shoulders and waist, like makeshift clothing. Their faces were broad and flat. Their noses were small. Their eyes were completely black. After a few seconds, the one adjusting the stones finished its work. It stood up and turned its head in my direction. And for a moment, we simply stared at each other across the trench. Then it reached into the dirt beside the stack and picked something up. The creature walked across the trench floor and set the object down near the excavator track before climbing back up the far wall. And within seconds, the rest of them followed. They disappeared into the darkness of the forest as quietly as they'd arrived. I walked over to the spot where the first one had left the object. It was a small bundle. A handful of thin roots tied tightly together with a strip of fiber. Threaded through the center of the bundle was a narrow white bone. Kevin came out of the trailer a minute later when he saw the floodlights shifting. He walked down to the trench and looked at the bundle in my hand. "They fixed the stack," I said. Kevin nodded slowly. "Good." I held up the bundle of roots and bone. They left this?" Kevin took it from my hand and examined it under the floodlight. "That means we were warned." "Warned about what?" I asked. Kevin looked toward the dark tree line where the small figures had disappeared. "Something worse underground." He handed the bundle back to me and climbed out of the trench. "Pack up your tools," he began. "We finish this job tomorrow and we move on." The next morning, the stacked stones were still standing exactly where we'd left them. None of us touched them. And that was the day I learned the second rule. If you uncover stacked stones in the Emerald Triangle, you leave them exactly where they are. Because if the things that build them decide to fix your mistake, it means you were lucky. Rule 3. If you find drawings underground, bag them. The third rule exists because the things living underground are not animals. They're organized. And if you work long enough digging holes in the Emerald Triangle, you will eventually see them. The first time I saw one was on a job in Mendocino County. Our crew had been hired to dig a foundation trench for a small groundwater monitoring station on a ridge about 15 miles inland from the coast. It was the kind of project that usually took 2 days. Dig the trench, set the forms, pour concrete, and move on. The clearing was small and surrounded by pine and scrub oak. The contractor's survey stakes were already in the ground, marking a straight 30-foot trench where the foundation footing would go. Brian Foster had the excavator running up by late morning. The soil there was a mix of clay and fractured rock. Nothing unusual. The bucket cut through it in steady layers, while I checked depth with a measuring rod, and Kevin Turner walked the perimeter, making sure we stayed inside the survey line. About halfway through the trench, Brian's bucket peeled back a section of rock that looked hollow behind it. He eased the boom forward again, and the trench wall collapsed inward. Behind the rock was a tunnel. Not a natural one. The interior walls were smooth and worn down in places, as if something had been moving through it for a long time. The floor sloped slightly downward, disappearing into darkness about 15 feet back. Kevin climbed down into the trench and shined a flashlight inside. "Hold the machine," he said. I stepped beside him and looked into the opening. Bones were scattered along the floor. Animal bones mostly. Deer, raccoon, smaller things. Mixed in with them were objects that had clearly come from the surface. A rusted shovel blade, an old flashlight, a broken plastic toolbox, and farther back along the wall, there were drawings scratched directly into the rock. At first they looked like crude lines, and then the pattern became clear. They were maps. Not just random shapes either. They showed roads running through towns along the coast, intersections, bridges, power stations, water reservoirs. Some of the drawings even showed clusters of houses laid out in neat blocks. Under those maps were other shapes, figures drawn beneath a line that represented the ground. The figures had long bodies, thick tails, and narrow heads. They looked exactly like reptiles. Kevin moved the flashlight deeper into the tunnel. Something shifted inside. The beam caught it for a second before it pulled back into the darkness. And that was the moment I saw it clearly. The thing standing inside the tunnel, it was about the size of a man. Its skin was pale gray-green and covered in small scales that caught the light like dull stone. Its arms were long and thin, ending in hands with narrow clawed fingers that looked perfect for digging through packed soil. Its face was flat and narrow. Two dark eyes reflected the beam of Kevin's flashlight. There was no mistaking what it looked like. A lizard person. The creature stood there watching us from inside the tunnel, and then it turned and slipped deeper into the passage, moving sideways through a narrow crack in the rock, like it'd done it 1,000 times before. Neither Kevin nor I spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Kevin lowered the flashlight. "Now you know what the drawings are for." We spent the next few minutes gathering the loose papers and copying what we could from the walls. Some of the maps were printed county surveys that had been stolen from somewhere on the surface. Others were hand-drawn plans showing tunnels branching outward under hillsides and roads. Several of them had arrows pointing toward larger towns along the coast. Under those arrows were dozens of the same reptile figures rising up from below. That afternoon, we saw 2 more of them near the trench. One appeared along the far edge of the clearing just before sunset. It stood upright among the trees, watching the machines, its tail hanging low behind it like a counterweight. When Brian swung the excavator in its direction, the creature slipped back into the brush and disappeared. The second one appeared after dark. I stepped outside the trailer to check the fuel tank on the generator, and I saw it standing halfway down the trench, studying the maps still scratched into the rock wall. It looked up at me. Its mouth opened slightly, showing a row of narrow teeth, and then it climbed straight up the trench wall and vanished into the forest. The next morning, Kevin told me the third rule. "If you find drawings underground, you bag 'em." "Why?" I asked. "Because those things are planning something." Later that day, we drove into town and stopped at the county sheriff's office. Kevin spread several of the maps across the front desk. The deputy leaned over him and frowned. "The hell's this?" he asked. Kevin pointed to the drawings of tunnels under a small coastal town. "We found them underground at a construction site." The deputy looked at the reptile figures drawn beneath the streets. Then he laughed. A kid draw these?" Another officer glanced over his shoulder. "Looks like somebody's fantasy art," he added. Kevin waited a moment, then gathered the papers back into the bag. Outside the station, he handed them to me. "That's the response I expected," he said. We shrugged, and then we drove back to the ridge and went back to work. But the third rule stayed with me after that, because those drawings were not imagination. They were plans, and the lizard people living under the Emerald Triangle have been preparing those plans for a long time. Rule 4. If the gnomes leave you a gift, leave the site before dark. The fourth rule only exists because the gnomes see things before we do. They live underground. They move through cracks in soil, the way raccoons move through brush. They know the tunnels better than any human ever could. And when they decide to warn you about something, you pay attention. The job where I learned that rule was in Humboldt County, about 30 miles inland from the coast. Our crew had been hired to cut a wide equipment pad into the side of a hill so a private company could install a small communications tower. The clearing was surrounded by tall redwoods and steep slopes of loose dirt and rock, the kind of place where heavy equipment has to move slowly, because one bad swing of a boom could send half the hillside sliding downward. Brian Foster had the excavator running by mid-morning. Kevin Turner walked the perimeter, checking the grade stakes, while Ethan Reed and I cleared roots and loose debris from the area where the foundation would go. By late afternoon, the cut was almost finished. And that's when I noticed the head. It was sitting on the steel track of the excavator. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal carcass, maybe a raccoon or a large lizard dragged out of the woods by a predator. And then I got closer. The head wasn't from any animal I recognized. The skin was pale and scaled, the same dull gray-green color as the creature we'd seen inside the tunnel back in Mendocino County. The jaw was narrow and filled with small pointed teeth. The eyes were gone. The neck ended in a rough tear where the body had been ripped away. It was the severed head of a lizard person. Kevin saw it the same moment I did. He walked over slowly, studying the track where the head rested. Then he looked around the clearing. "You didn't put that there, right?" I shook my head. "Neither did I," Kevin said from behind us. Brian climbed down the excavator cab and stared at it. "What the hell is that thing?" he asked. Kevin didn't answer him. Instead, he crouched down beside the track and examined the ground. Small footprints covered the dirt around the machine. 3-toed prints, about the size of a child's foot. Gnome tracks. Kevin stood up again. "That's a gift," he said. I looked at him. "A gift?" He nodded once. "They're warning us." "Warning us about what?" Ethan asked. Kevin glanced toward the tree line. "About what's coming." We finished shutting down the machines immediately. Kevin wanted everyone off the site before sunset. But the job had one problem. The excavator was sitting in a deep cut we'd carved into the hillside. The ramp leading out of the pad had partially collapsed earlier that afternoon when a section of loose soil gave way under the tracks. Brian could still drive the machine out, but it would take time to rebuild the ramp with a dozer blade and bucket. Leaving it overnight was not an option. If the ground shifted again, the excavator could slide down the slope and take half the hillside with it. Kevin cursed under his breath. "Fine, we fix the ramp and we get out." Brian started the machine again, while Ethan and I hauled rocks and loose dirt into the ramp cut to stabilize it. The sun was already dropping behind the trees. The shadows grew longer across the clearing. And that's when the first lizard person appeared. It climbed out of the trench wall on the far side of the pad. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, its long tail trailing behind it across the dirt. Its scaled skin looked almost black in the fading light. It watched us without moving, and then another one appeared beside it, and another. They came out of the ground through cracks and holes along the edge of the clearing. Some crawled up the trench walls. Others slipped between the trees at the edge of the site. There were 6 of them, maybe more. Brian swung the excavator boom toward him. The closest creature hissed and backed away, disappearing behind a pile of loose rock. But the others stayed right where they were. "Move faster," Kevin said. Ethan and I shoveled dirt into the ramp while Brian worked the bucket back and forth, packing the slope tight enough for the machine to climb. Another lizard person appeared near the generator trailer, and this one moved differently. Instead of standing upright, it crawled low across the ground until it reached the fuel cans beside the trailer. Then it lifted its head and stared directly at Ethan. He froze. "Don't move," Kevin said. The creature tilted its head as if studying him, and then it lunged. Ethan jumped backward just as the lizard person grabbed the edge of the trench wall and tried to pull itself onto the pad. Brian reacted instantly. He swung the excavator bucket down and smashed it into the dirt beside the creature. The impact sent a wave of loose soil cascading into the trench. The lizard person vanished under the falling dirt, and 2 more appeared along the far edge of the clearing. One of them dragged something across the ground behind it, a length of wire. Another creature crawled out of a narrow hole near the base of a tree. There were more of them now. I could see movement everywhere along the edge of the site. Kevin pointed toward the ramp. "Brian, get the machine out." Brian backed the excavator toward the ramp and started climbing slowly up the slope we'd rebuilt. The ground trembled under the weight of the tracks. As the machine reached the top of the ramp, a small figure darted across the clearing. One of the gnomes. It ran straight to the trench and hurled a fist-sized rock down into one of the openings where the lizard people had appeared. Another gnome followed it, then another. They moved quickly, throwing rocks and chunks of dirt into the holes, collapsing parts of the trench wall. One of the lizard people lunged toward them. The gnomes scattered instantly, vanishing into the forest. Brian finally drove the excavator into solid ground then. Kevin waved the rest of us toward the trucks. "Move!" We didn't argue. Within seconds, the engines were running and the headlights were cutting through the trees as we drove down the narrow dirt road and away from the site. None of us spoke until the clearing disappeared behind us. Kevin was the first one to break the silence. "And that's why, if they leave you a gift, you leave the site before dark." I looked back through the rear window toward the ridge we'd just abandoned. The trees had already swallowed the clearing completely. Somewhere up there, the lizard people were crawling back through the trenches we'd dug. And I wonder if the gnomes were sealing the holes behind them. Rule 5. If the hole breathes warm air, fill it in and leave the dead where they are. The 5th rule is the one nobody likes to talk about. It's the rule that tells you when a job has already gone too far. Kevin didn't explain it until the worst night our crew ever had. The job was in Trinity County, high up along a ridge where the forest opened into patches of exposed rock and loose soil. A contractor had hired us to dig a deep equipment footing for a monitoring station that was supposed to track seismic activity along a nearby fault line. At least that's what the paperwork said. The clearing was small and uneven. Half the work involved cutting back the hillside just to make room for the machines. Brian Foster had the excavator working the slope while Ethan Reed and I measured the trench lines Kevin Turner had marked earlier that morning. By late afternoon, we had a pit nearly 8 feet deep. The bottom layer was solid rock. Brian switched the excavator to a heavier bucket and started chipping at the stone to widen the footing.
And that's when the ground opened. The bucket struck a fracture line, and a section of rock broke away with a loud crack. The piece slid down the pit wall and exposed a dark opening beneath it. At first it looked like another tunnel, but the air coming out of the opening felt different. Warm. Not just slightly warmer than the outside air. Hot. I stepped closer to the pit, and I held my hand near the opening. A steady current of warm air was flowing out of the rock. It smelled like sulfur and wet metal. Kevin climbed down into the pit and shined his flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed smooth black stone inside. Not rough like normal rock. It looked melted. Thick iron spikes had been driven into the walls in several places. Their surfaces rusted and fused into the stone as if they'd been there for decades. A length of chain hung between two of them, half buried in mineral deposits. Bones were scattered along the floor of the chamber. Some animal bones, some not. Kevin lowered the flashlight slowly. "That's deep ground." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. Kevin looked at him with an expression I had never seen before. "Means this job wasn't about building something." Brian killed the excavator engine. The clearing went quiet, except for the low sound of warm air moving through the hole. I leaned over the edge of the pit and looked down again. The opening inside the rock was widening. Something was pushing against the chamber wall from below. The stone cracked then. A thin black shape slid through the gap. At first it looked like a limb, and then the rest of the body followed. The creature climbing out of the chamber was much taller than any of the lizard people we'd seen before. Its skin was dark red and black, cracked like dried clay. Thin lines of glowing heat ran through the cracks along its arms and chest. Where the warm air touched the surface of the pit, steam rose from its skin. Its arms were long and narrow. Its fingers ended in sharp black points that dug into the rock as it pulled itself upward. And the face was the worst part. It looked almost human at first glance. And then the jaw opened wider than it should have. Inside was a row of jagged teeth, shaped like broken stone. The creature dragged itself halfway out of the chamber, paused, and looked directly at us. Movement exploded then around the clearing. 2 lizard people appeared along the edge of the pit. They'd been watching from the trench lines we dug earlier. The moment they saw the thing climbing from the chamber, both of them froze. For a second, none of the creatures moved. And then the lizard people turned and ran. They vanished into the forest without hesitation. Kevin climbed out of the pit immediately. "Everyone back," he said. "What is that thing?" Ethan asked. Kevin didn't take his eyes off the hole. "Something that should have stayed buried." The creature inside the pit pulled itself higher. Its claws scraped across the rock as it climbed toward the surface. Kevin turned toward Brian. "Start the machine." Brian didn't move. "There's still equipment down there," he said. Kevin shook his head. "We're not retrieving anything." The creature's head rose above the edge of the pit. Steam rolled off its body where the cool air hit it. Kevin pointed at the excavator. "Collapse the hole." The creature lifted one arm out of the pit. The claws dug into the soil beside the opening. Brian finally started the excavator. The engine roared to life. He swung the boom over the pit and dropped the bucket into the loose soil beside the opening. A massive load of dirt and rock slid down into the chamber, crashing onto the creature below. but it didn't stop climbing. The thing pushed through the falling dirt, its claws ripping through the soil as if it weighed nothing.
More!
Kevin shouted. Brian filled the bucket again and dumped more dirt into the hole. This time a section of the pit wall collapsed with it. Half the trench slid downward, burying the opening under tons of dirt and broken rock. This time, the creature vanished beneath the collapse. For a few seconds, the ground trembled, and then everything went still. Warm air continued to seep through the loose soil where the pit had been, but nothing else moved. Kevin watched the ground for a long moment, and then he spoke.
If the hole breathes warm air, you fill it in and you leave the dead where they are.
None of us argued. We packed the pit with every load of dirt the excavator could move, until the hole was completely buried. By the time we finished, the clearing looked like a landslide had taken half the hillside. We shut down the machines, and we left the site before sunset. No one spoke on the drive down the ridge. The official report later said that the ground had collapsed into an unstable fault pocket. Equipment loss. End of investigation. Kevin told me later that the fifth rule always applies the moment warm air starts coming out of the ground. Once that happens, you collapse the hole and you seal it back up. No exceptions. Because if a pit like that is breathing, it means the ground has opened into something deeper. And if someone's still down there when that happens, they're not getting out. They're already too close to whatever lives on the other side of that rock. So you fill the hole, and you leave the dead where they are. We never went back to that site. A different crew came in a few weeks later with smaller equipment and a new contract number. From what I heard, they filled the rest of the pit with gravel and poured a concrete cap over the entire area before installing the monitoring station on top of it. The official explanation was simple. Unstable ground, seismic fault pocket, construction hazard. That's the kind of language reports always use when something strange happens on a job site. It sounds technical enough that nobody asks questions. Our crew didn't argue with the report. We signed the paperwork, packed the equipment, and moved on to the next contract like nothing had happened. That's how these things usually go. If you work construction long enough in the Emerald Triangle, you'll hear stories about people disappearing. Some vanish while hiking. Some vanish after wandering onto private land. Some simply drive down the wrong road and never come back. Most people blame drugs, crime, or the wilderness. Those explanations make sense to anyone who's never spent time digging into the ground out there. But the truth is a little different. Under the hills of Northern California, there's an entire world most people never see. Tunnels running beneath ridges and forest. Stone chambers sealed decades ago. Traps packed with chemicals that kill. Creatures that move through the dirt as easily as we walk across pavement. The lizard people are real. I've seen them standing in trench lines watching our machines. I've seen their maps scratched into rock walls showing roads and towns they plan to reach someday. The gnomes are real too. They're small and strange, but they're not our enemies. Most of the time, they're the only reason crews like ours get any warning at all when something bad starts moving underground. And deeper than both of them are things that should never reach the surface. Things the ground was sealed to hold back. The companies that hire excavation crews in that part of the state, I think they know about it. They won't say it directly, but some of those contracts exist for one reason: to check the ground. Most workers never realize what they're actually doing. They just see a good paycheck and a remote job site. The ones who figure it out are usually the ones who last, because the rules matter. People think the Emerald Triangle is dangerous because of the things that grow above the ground. That's not the whole story. Sure, some men disappear because of criminals. Some disappear because the forest is big and unforgiving. But a lot of them disappear because of what lives under the soil. Crews like ours, they lose more workers than anyone will ever admit in public records. The holes get filled, the paperwork gets filed, and the truth stays buried with everything else.